Guys, welcome back to another video for Booktober. And if you don't know what Booktober is this series that I'm doing where for every day for the month of October I read and review a book that is befitting of the month, whether it's creepy, horror, thriller, I suppose, psychological thriller, or dark academia, anything of the like. I talk about it, read about it, etc., etc. And the book for today is gonna have to be Etiquette and Espionage by Gail Carriger. And it's like the first book in an installment called like the Finishing School, I guess. If you don't know what it's about, I understand. I don't think it's like super niche, but it may not be as popular as other books. So just to give you a brief synopsis, a brief rundown of what Etiquette and Espionage is about. It basically follows the main character, Sophronia, and she lives in a steampunk society. Like, it's Victorian England, I believe. It's Victorian England styled, but like there's obvious steampunk elements to the story. Sophronia, as befitting of very early Victorian society, she is sent to finishing school. And for those of you who don't know what finishing school is, finishing school was this one thing back in ye olden days where they would send girls out to these schools to become proper ladies, to learn proper lady things and be polite members of society, etc., right? They didn't actually like learn school like how we learn school. There wasn't like mathematics or physics or chemistry or anything like that. It was mostly like, what dinner fork do you use? What about the salad fork? What are we doing with those curtsies, girls? Why are they not low enough? And so that was what finishing school was, and Sophronia was sent to one. And unbeknownst to her guardians, she ended up in a finishing school where they basically trained the women, the girls into women, to not only learn about how to become a polite member of society and about like the etiquette of everything, but also how to become effective spies as well. And of course, nobody talked about this in the pamphlets, nobody talked about this in the brochures, but like Sophronia is like, actually, this feels like a cool school. Like, I'm really willing to stay and learn everything I can, etc. And so that's like an entire series, the Finishing School series, and book one is just the Etiquette and Espionage portion of it, but it's really interesting to me. And I decided that for this Booktober, I wanted to talk about at least like one steampunk book because I believe that it's kind of going out of style at the moment. I feel like there was a larger demographic that read steampunk back in, I don't know, like to the 2010s or something like that, but it's really becoming dated in a way, and I just hate that. And B, I think steampunk can be October-esque. I mean, like, not only is Sophronia in the steampunk society, she's in a steampunk society with vampires, with werewolves, and, you know, as a spy, and like with like talking robots and stuff like that. Like, is that not the coolest thing or what? The book itself, I feel like the writing in it is very overtly Victorian, but I mean, like, and it's like very overtly in a way that's almost camp, but at the same time it kind of lends to its charm. It kind of is what you expect it to be because of the fact that it is, you know, lending from those Victorian era stuff. And so like it adds to the atmosphere, the setting of it all. It adds to the fact that you're reading about steampunk and the way that it crafts that narrative with its own narrative voice. There were so many parts of this book that were super interesting to me. Like, the concept itself was like, oh, that's like new, I suppose, to me. I don't know if like there are other steampunk books out there with finishing schools that teach ladies how to become spies, but if there are, like, let me know. But it's for all its Victorian era-esque stuff, I feel like it was a nice read. Like, it didn't feel like parts of it lagged or anything like that. It felt like once you actually got the hang of reading in that way, it was smooth sailing from there. It kind of flowed in a way that's nice, and it didn't feel like it dragged or lagged in any areas in particular. It was also very witty with its own tone. Like there was like moments of sarcasm within the prose and stuff like that, and like moments of very tongue-in-cheekness, which I feel like you should be able to enjoy even in a Victorian society, and you probably did enjoy in a Victorian society because of the fact that, again, you're trying to be polite in front of company, but at the same time you're like, how do I say very politely, very properly that I hate you, or you're dumb, or something like that, like you're stupid, get out of my face. But like, oh, Lord Tewkesbury, so there's that aspect embedded within the writing itself. The characters themselves I liked. I enjoyed the characters. I liked the way that in this book, Sophronia is like 14 and she goes to like this finishing school. She's surrounded by other girls of her age and stuff like that. And it's surprising that like there's no romance in this, because I don't know, I've come to expect romances, I guess, with every book that I'm given a slice of, but this was refreshing in the way that it didn't force a romance onto me that didn't make sense. Like, if it didn't make sense, it didn't have it. And I was like, okay, that's great. And like Sophronia's like dynamic with the girls around her, and like her gaining a friend group, etc., that was very much interesting for me to read about. I really did enjoy that. Like, in regards to those relationship buildings, we focus more on like relationships, friendships between women and stuff like that. Friendships between girls and stuff like that. Like, I feel like that was refreshing in that regard. You don't see that a lot unless you're aiming to write books for younger audiences, for middle grade audiences in a way. And I guess like Sophronia being like 14, I suppose this could be aimed at younger audiences. And the prose itself isn't super hard to the point where a 14-year-old couldn't read it. I believe it's doable. Again, there may be some words that the kid will have to look up, but it's actually pretty okay in terms of reading it. Like, there's nothing wrong with the sentence structure, the grammatics of everything. Like, it felt like it flowed in a way that made sense, and in a way that didn't feel alienating to either the text or the context itself, which is very cool to see, and not that easy actually, now that I think about it. However, if you came here for plot, maybe don't come anymore, because in terms of plot, it didn't promise anything in the synopsis. From what I read of the synopsis on Goodreads, like, it didn't promise anything in terms of plot, and it does not deliver anything either. Like, it's like, I promised nothing about plot. I gave you a concept. I gave you an idea. Here's an idea, a concept. And as for plot, I didn't say that there was going to be a plot. And you know what? You were the dummy. You were the fool for thinking there was going to be a plot. And it got to the point where it could get repetitive and very much tiring, especially the fact that like they're at school, but they're on a school that's like floating. So, you know, they're kind of isolated from everywhere else, and like the only time you get to see anything interesting is whenever they get to see anything interesting, and it's usually whenever like they go on field trips or like make stops and stuff like that and go to a ball, etc. And you're just like, at that point you feel kind of marooned on the same ship as them, and then you see like an island of entertainment, an island of interesting, and you're like, please. It's a whole thing. And if you're not into reading the repetitive day-to-day of like a teenage girl, then this is definitely not the book for you. And yeah, no, saying all that, as you would probably guess, the pacing itself is kind of wonky in that regard, because of the way that like there are some moments that just drag on, and then there are some moments that are like, oh, this was pretty interesting, and then we go back to our daily tedium, and it's like, man, you give us one bit of interesting and now you want to go back to learning fanning lessons and swooning lessons. All right. However, one thing that kind of did break the monotony up for me just a little bit is, again, like the concept of the finishing school being a finishing school for spies. And so you have some very interesting classes, very interesting characters as well that head these classes, that teach these classes and what they expect out of these girls and stuff like that. And so like you have some interesting subjects that you learn alongside with the girls, and you're like, oh, they're learning how to stuff their weapons inside a very neatly concealed like handkerchief. They're trying to learn the language of the fans in order to be able to understand code in the language of the fans and stuff like that. Like this means this, etc., etc. Like that language, but like code version. Oh, they're learning how to swoon properly as a proper young lady, so that, and swoon just means faint, but like how to swoon in a way that is attention grabbing in order to create a diversion if you need to, for like specific reconnaissance missions and stuff like that. So there's those parts that broke up the monotony for me. And of course, like the friendships, obviously. Like I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so invested in their friendships. I'm so glad they're friends, etc., etc. And then like we kept going back to the books, back to the same old routine, same old tired things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this really makes me feel like I'm back at school. That's crazy. Like, how did you do that? And, you know, I guess you could say there's like a point for the accuracy of how tedious school can be and how it can be very tiring having to learn over and over for the rest of your days until you finish. Like every day you're learning something new and you're just looking forward to something specific, like something outside the box and stuff like that. But unless you're making mischief for yourself, you're kind of stuck in that loop, you know? So you gotta come up with interesting things to do on your own. And that's kind of what the girls were doing, they were trying. And that's kind of what I had to do as well whenever I was reading this book. It took me a while to finish because of how I felt personally that it dragged just a bit more than what I was gonna excuse. But it's a good concept. It's a good character, I guess, like interpersonal character relationships and stuff like that. Like I was invested in that, and I was enjoying the world building itself as well. Like I felt like the world itself felt kind of vague but imaginative. Like vague as in like there's no specific set rules. Like you can have a vampire, you can have a werewolf, and you can have like AI, not AI, but like automaton or whatever. And yet it felt imaginative because of the way the world also considered the interactions between these elements, and rather than just having it like as isolated elements within the story. So props to that. I guess the fact that they're at a finishing school means that like they're at a boarding school-esque type of setting. So you could also kind of categorize this as dark academia if you were to push the envelope just a little bit. Like that's kind of dark academia, right? Like you're at a boarding school, you're learning something, and nefarious plots are afoot. However, like the nefarious plot afoot in this book was kind of lame. I guess like lame, but because of the way that you were stuck in this tedium for a while, it was just kind of like a welcome reprieve. Thank goodness something's happening here. So if we were to actually categorize this as dark academia, I would actually give it like an A+ in the application of dark academia, because this is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to dark academia. I'm like, dark academia is literally just used to death at this rate because of like, you know, the advent of aesthetics or whatever. And we just talk about it in the sense that like, oh my gosh, like there's sepia browns and coffee and staying up all night to read the classics, etc., etc. Not to make fun of people who enjoy dark academia. I can enjoy the genre as well. Every now and then I'll slip up, but I just feel like because of the way that dark academia is, because of the way that it's structured, it's not exactly inclusive in that respect. And so like because of the way that it's not very inclusive, it also reminds me of educational elitism, where in those private schools, in those high upper echelon schools, you know, like those were made so that like education could be hierarchical between classes and stuff like that. Because originally education was something that only the rich could afford, really. It was a luxury. And then as people became more standardized to be educated and stuff like that, as like school became more of a mandated thing and etc. and stuff, private schools were created so that they could rise above it in a way. Like private schools, boarding schools, etc. They kind of give me those vibes, I guess, like the way that they try their best to disassociate themselves from the lower class, from the bourgeoisie. Yeah, I guess I do mean it in the French way, but in the way that like the French used it as like, well, not, I don't know if the French did use it. I'm not putting words in their mouth, but the way that it's like supposed to be that class between the peasantry and like the aristocracy, and there's like that middle ground of like people that are just like there. Yeah, that bourgeoisie, not the capitalist class, like those Marxist doctrine and all that. But I digress. So the way that those private schools, elite schools, etc., kind of like try to separate themselves in that way kind of feels insidious to me. It does. I'm sure, I mean, like, there's also scholarship programs and stuff like that they allow and such, but it's interesting how it's like those scholarship programs only look for exceptional students and stuff like that. You got to be exceptional to come here, you know, like we don't just pick anybody. And it's just interesting the way that it separates people based on the class of better, just the class of more exceptional in that way. And so I feel like dark academia, I could get into it, but because of the way that it just reminds me of that academic elitism, I'm not really into it too much. However, dark academia in the instance of this finishing school in the Victorian style era and being in like a steampunk society actually oddly works for me because of the way that it does something different with schooling. First of all, it specifically focuses on schooling historically for women, and the way that women are often taught these things of like the tenets of docility, I guess, the tenets of femininity, and in the way that like they try to domesticate women in that way. However, in this finishing school in particular, they're actually behind those tenets, behind those seemingly docile, seemingly feminine principles, not principles, subjects, no, skills, techniques, no, principles, they still find a way to like slip in the knife under you, you know what I'm saying? They still find a way to arm these women with ways to defend themselves, with ways to manipulate their surroundings, etc., and actually like add to their toolbox. And it also doesn't condemn femininity in that way because of the way that it's like, oh no, yeah, like it's very much, this Barbie is a spy, you know, like it's like not bimbo exactly, but in the way that Barbie core is like being used to uplift and empower femininity instead of demonizing it the way that it is in past media, I suppose, and in the way that it is in some media now, but like just the way that, especially like with Mean Girls and stuff like that, the way that femininity and girl world was seen as something very much nasty or very much underhanded. But this kind of like complements that underhandedness, that underhanded stereotype, and makes it in like a better light, in a more empowering light. And the way that dark academia, it is academia itself because of the way, if you think about it, finishing schools were teaching this one thing. It's its own academia. I mean, like, being a woman is valid, like, and like teaching a woman like proper manners and like politeness and stuff like that is valid. Like embroidering or whatever, all these hallmarks of like traditional feminism are valid. And so like teaching it as a valid educational form, and then still having that undertone of like darkness, not darkness exactly, but that undertone of something not quite right, that undertone of something that is just a little bit, it spins the world on its head a little bit and just may seem nefarious because of the way that you would need to use these skills if you were dealing with nefarious characters. And so the way that like the author Carrigan actually constructs these classes and constructs the instructors and stuff like that, and like the atmosphere for these classes in a way that's that feels informative and academic, yet at the same time it feels dark enough that it makes the book able to categorize itself under dark academia. I feel like, I don't know why I'm arguing for the book's case. I don't know who I'm arguing towards to or whatever. I don't know, but I feel like it's really a good book in the way that it develops its concepts and themes. In terms of plot, not really. But yeah, that's all I have for today.